Hello, everyone. My name is Nir Feinberg, and I'm currently a PhD student in the group in Buddhist Studies at UC Berkeley. I'm here today with Professor Niklaus Largier, professor in the German and Comparative Literature departments, and we're going to discuss the topic of seclusion for the Berkeley Center for the Studies of Religion Public Forum on Pandemic and Religion. Professor Largier current research and teaching focuses on the history of imagination and the emotions, and on the history of the senses, and of the production of sense experience from the Middle Ages to the modern era. He is also an expert in the mystical traditions in German literature and thought, in particular Meister Eckhart and his influence. So moving to the topic we're going to talk about today, many of us lately have found themselves sheltering in place or kind of withdrawing from their everyday usual worldly kind of experiences. And the issue we're going to talk about, or the question we're going to talk about today, is how this kind of shift in the normal dynamic circumstances we find ourselves into a more kind of static environment and situation changes our ability to kind of reflect on our experiences of the world and so on and so forth. So, Niklaus, presenting this issue to you, how do you understand this state of seclusion and its impact on our ability to kind of reflect and think about our experience of the world?
I can start on a personal level, maybe, having gone through that like everybody else in our situation currently. And when I just talked about teaching at a moment ago with somebody, and what is really remarkable for me is how much in teaching on Zoom, kind of the absence of the ambient noise or just all the ambient elements that usually are there, like movements and noise and kind of people whispering to each other or things like that, is actually missing in that environment. So it's not just kind of the eye contact, which is also missing because you always don't know where to look. You kind of tend to look at somebody on the screen, but obviously the person can't see that you're actually looking at them. There's just this general absence of this ambient, permanent involvement that we're usually not even that aware of it. And somehow the seclusion, or what is called shelter in place here, has really cut into that on many levels. And so what happened to me is actually early on during the pandemic, I went back for, I don't know what exactly, personal psychological reasons, to literature of the so-called desert fathers who went back withdrawing, or who withdrew from the world, as we call it. And in that sense, we could say shelter in place, and obviously a different way than we have to do it. But in a way, kind of isolating themselves and reducing, as one might think at first, all these ambient elements of our daily involvement with the world, and producing, one could say, artificially that kind of isolation. Obviously, we're not in the desert. We sit in our comfortable houses in our privileged situation here, but still there is something similar there. And my new hero, I told you before, is Isaac the Syrian, or Isaac of Nineveh, one of these people who withdrew into the desert in the first centuries of the Christian era. I can talk more about it, or do you want to
I
chip
think
in
that's
here?
interesting. Just to kind of frame it, I think a question we might be inclined to talk about is, so when you're withdrawing from the world and removing yourself from a kind of more dynamic situation, you were talking about these ambient sounds and things you're usually coming in contact with, and all of a sudden finding yourselves surrounded by the same walls and maybe with a certain silence or the environment of the desert. The question is whether that kind of secluded experience, what can it later tell us about our more kind of mundane experience that we're used to, being in the world, watching people cross the street, going in contact with people and going back into a kind of more familiar environment. So I think it's an interesting question to keep in mind, is what does this kind of secluded or solitary experience tell us about later on what we normally experience being more involved in the world? But let's jump into the text you were
Yeah, but
looking at.
what's remarkable is that, and when people who have read these texts are aware of it, that seclusion doesn't just mean kind of retiring into a position of quiet and stillness. So in that sense, it also resonates with what happens to us at the moment, or at least to me, because what you read in these texts written by people who move into that situation of a voluntary seclusion is that they actually produce an incredible awareness towards what's happening to them on many levels. You could even think of it as a kind of, to use a modern term, a kind of an installation that allows for the exploration of all kinds of emotions, sensations, psychological attitudes, we might call it nowadays. So there's actually many correspondences with people who are in shelter in place. They perceive it as isolation, as depression, maybe as anxiety, as a situation that produces resentment, etc. And when you read these texts, what they draw attention to, I would argue, is actually that under these conditions, they address, or they start to address, all the elements of the, I like to call it kind of the texture of the life of the soul, or the layers in the textures of the life of the soul. And by that, I mean, like, yeah, for example, anger. It's very typical to read about anger and how you address anger, resentment, anxiety, etc. And on the other side, how you can get out of this and produce moments of joy or something like that. I'm not sure whether that's really an answer to your question, but it
No,
is, yeah.
I'm thinking, you know, this is really interesting because in the tradition that I'm familiar with, there is always this question or tension that comes around, like in these Indian traditions of renunciation. For example, the Buddhists and the Jains and other traditions, the question is whether you need the kind of conditions or situation that is secluded in order to develop that sensitivity, or is that you're beginning to develop that sensitivity and that kind of drives you to move away from the world, because the only place where you can find the circumstances and the conditions that you need in order to fully absorb yourself and realize that these kind of textures of perception is in that secluded area, for example. So there was a question, you first need to move to shelter in place, for example, or isolate yourself, and then this kind of understanding emerges, or are you understanding something essential about that and that pushes you to seclude yourself, renounce, or withdraw from the world? But
Yeah,
should we look at the text? I feel like we'll never get to the text in this.
It's a difficult question, obviously, insofar as it assumes like a decision. Yeah. So what is first along these lines? So, and I think it is complicated. I mean, in many cases in these texts, there is an intent there, an intention to reform their lives. And in the Christian tradition, it is you could say, an evangelical decision to follow Christ, etc. There are all these elements that play into this. But in order to address it, then that's where the isolation, I think, comes into place. So you produce this withdrawal at first. And I think there are more elements that appear there. So you produce the withdrawal, and in the situation of withdrawal, to put it in somewhat idealistic terms, you get more clarity. at first, or that's the goal. But at the same time, this clarity is also very, very complicated, because the clarity means that everything erupts within you. But the most famous example along these lines, I've talked about this with many students often, is the example of Saint Anthony, who goes into the desert and then has to fight with these demons all his life. So there is that element which brings out the texture at first. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah, completely. I also think it's somehow not, it shouldn't be a causal kind of mechanism that we think first this happens and then that happens. And perhaps there's other ways of thinking about this relationship between understanding or clarity and withdrawal as something that have to do with a shared kind of meaning that these terms have. This is often also another position developed in Indian philosophy by a philosopher named Shankara, who thinks that you renounce or you understand the world. These are somehow related to one another intrinsically. So it's not a matter of understanding what comes first. But
yeah,
it's also,
it's something I also find remarkable, that in that context, understanding plays a very important role, but you can also think of the situation as a kind of dramatization of their existence. So
yeah.
first you dramatize your existence, exposing yourself to all that, and then understanding comes into place. I mean, the tradition of self-knowledge plays a very important role in that as well, the know thyself. But then as a third element also, the transformation. It's not just, as I said at the beginning, withdrawing into a state of tranquility, which is the goal, but it's connected to a self-transformation that is only, I would say, only possible in that form, at least under these conditions of the withdrawal. And to use a modern term, we have talked about this before. I would say what they produce first in the isolation is something like a phenomenology often. That is, they engage with themselves and bring these textures of the life of the soul into visibility and explore it. One could say it's an exploration of what is at stake. And it's a dramatic exploration. There are forces that battle each other, so to speak, demons and hopes and so on.
Yeah, I mean, and the question always is, and of course this is a problematic binary we're going to come up with, but we're thinking of some of this as happening internally, but then they are also not thinking of that necessarily as an internal process, as you were talking about facing one's demons and so on and so forth. But somehow, again, coming back to the question I brought up to begin with, somehow that changes the perception of the world on any different level, both in the everyday world and in the isolated situation, right?
Yeah.
That experience, that heightened or dramatized experience one has within seclusion.
I think, and it's also something I mentioned before in our conversation, the other conversations, it's good, and it's maybe a little bit too schematic or polemical to think of it as, on one side, a stoic kind of goal of tranquility, and then on the other side, a goal of transformation. And at least, and that's, I think, where the study of religion, or whatever we want to call it, the study of these texts, tells us a lot about a way of engaging the forces that shape us, so to speak, not in terms of a goal to find serene tranquility only. It plays a role as well, but as an engagement that always entails a transformation of the perception of yourself, of the way you inhabit your body, so to speak, or the perception of yourself as an embodied being, and also the perception of the world. It's a very prominent, I mean, it's also very paradoxical when I read these texts. I mean, they move into that situation, and then all they speak about is how joyous they are. I must say, as a footnote, it's not that easy for me in the shelter-in-place to find that overwhelming
Enjoy.
joy. Yeah. But the joy is a product of this first engaging kind of the textures, and then the active kind of transformation of all the elements that are at stake. That is the anger, but the joy on the other side, bringing hope into play. It's a kind of a dramaturgy of the life of the soul, you could call it, from a more kind of maybe less religious point of view, but still.
Yes, I mean, so if we'll try to kind of wrap this up into some kind of a conversation about what it is that the shelter in place or these conditions of seclusion create. So you would say on the surface, it first builds up this theater in which we can dramatize the life of the soul, and then later on kind of become this audience or this maybe particular potential receiver of this experience, and where you find this affective engagement and joy and sadness and hatred and so forth. How would you look at this?
Yeah, I mean, in the Christian context of the texts I'm talking about here concretely, they think about this transformation along the lines of a participation in the divine and in the self-communication of the divine, that usually, in order, when we can go back to the ambient noise of our everyday life, that usually within living in this ambient noise and this noise of the world, which is pleasurable and annoying and all these elements, is not easily accessible. So in order for them, I would argue, to make it accessible, to make that participation in the divine accessible, that they need the seclusion, as exactly how you portray it, yeah, an installation of that drama first, but then also a place where this transformation can happen, that you could say opens up a different vision of the world, or a different way of inhabiting the world.
That's a positive way of thinking of the process we're all going through now. But anyways, I'd like to thank you for this conversation and
thank you.
This invitation in general.
It was a pleasure talking to you.